For over 60 years, one of the largest armies the world had ever seen rolled across Eurasia like a storm no civilization could outrun. The Mongols didn't just conquer, they erased. From Korea to Poland, 13 million square miles bent under the hooves of their horses, creating the largest contiguous empire in human history. Entire kingdoms vanished. Cities that resisted were wiped off the map. Baghdad, the intellectual crown of the Islamic world, was burned to the ground in 1258, its libraries destroyed, its scholars massacred, its streets clogged with bodies. Chroniclers wrote that the rivers ran red with blood, and Mongol generals built pyramids of skulls as warnings to anyone foolish enough to dream of fighting back. This was not an army that won through numbers alone. The Mongols were unmatched battlefield engineers, masters of speed, deception, and psychological warfare. Their riders could cover 50 miles a day. Their archers could turn a full circle in the saddle and hit a moving target at full gallop. Their feigned retreats shattered disciplined armies. Their terror tactics broke empires before the fighting even began. And now that unstoppable force had arrived in the Middle East. Under the command of Kitbuka, one of the Great Khan's most ruthless and loyal generals, the Mongols had seized Aleppo, devastated Damascus, and swept through Syria with terrifying speed. Their next target was Cairo, the beating heart of the Mamluk Sultanate. If Cairo fell, the Islamic world would follow. But the defenders of Egypt were unlike any army the Mongols had faced before. The Mamluks were not born soldiers, they were made. Taken as children, purchased as slaves, raised inside military academies where failure meant death, and trained until war became instinct. Master horsemen, expert archers, cavalry who knew the deserts better than any foreign invader. Their loyalty wasn't to a king or dynasty, it was to each other. A brotherhood forged in hardship and bound by steel. What happens next would become one of the most significant turning points in world history. Because here, on the edge of Egypt, for the first time in 6 decades, someone would stand in the Mongols' path and refuse to kneel. Stay tuned, because the clash that's coming isn't just a battle. It's the moment the world discovered the Mongols could be stopped. But to truly understand why the Battle of Ain Jalut became one of the most significant turning points in world history, we have to look at the men who dared to stand against the unstoppable. At the center of the story is Sultan Kutuz, an ex-slave, a man who had spent most of his life in the shadows. Just 3 years before the battle, he was a virtually unknown officer in Cairo. Now he ruled an empire hanging by a thread. And when the Mongols sent their infamous ultimatum, surrender and live, or resist and be annihilated, everyone expected Kutuz to bow, as so many kings had before him. Instead, he did the unthinkable. Kutuz executed the Mongol envoys, cut off their heads, and nailed them to the gates of Cairo for the whole city to see. It was the most dangerous declaration of war imaginable. No one killed Mongol ambassadors and lived. No city that resisted survived. His own advisors thought he had doomed Egypt, but Kutuz wasn't acting alone. At his side stood Baibars, his greatest general, a tactical mastermind, and, like Kutuz, a former Mamluk slave. Baibars understood the Mongols in a way few commanders ever had. He studied their battles, their feigned retreats, their scouting patterns, and their devastating shock assaults. And he knew that the only way to defeat one of the most fearsome armies on earth was to make them predictable, and then trap them. Baibars devised a bold plan. The Mamluks would lure the Mongols into a narrow valley, Ain Jalut, a tight, rugged landscape in what is now the West Bank. Mongol cavalry depended on open plains to maneuver and surround their enemies. In a valley, their speed became useless. Their formations broke down. Their archers were restricted. This was where Baibars believed he could break them. But even the best strategy needs a leader willing to risk everything. Kutuz made another decision that shocked his court. He would personally lead the charge into battle. This was unheard of for a medieval ruler. Sultans stayed behind the lines, protected, observing from safety. But Kutuz knew his army was facing the Mongols, warriors who had humiliated empires many times larger than Egypt. The Mamluks needed more than orders. They needed a leader willing to bleed beside them. And when Kutuz mounted his horse and rode to the front, something shifted. Soldiers who expected to die suddenly believed they could win. An army that had never faced the Mongols suddenly found courage. In that moment, Qutuz wasn't just a sultan. He became the symbol of resistance for an entire civilization. The stage was set. The trap was ready. And for the first time in 60 years, the Mongol war machine was walking straight into an ambush. At dawn on September 3rd, 1260, the trap was ready. The valley of Ain Jalut, quiet, rugged, and narrow, waited like a drawn bowstring. And right on cue, as Baibars predicted, the first Mongol wave appeared. Roughly 1,000 elite scouts, some of the finest light cavalry in the world. What they saw ahead of them looked perfect. A small, terrified Mamluk force breaking and retreating. Panic, as always, was the Mongols' favorite weapon. But this retreat wasn't panic, it was precision. The Mamluks fell back step by step, firing arrows with deadly accuracy, drawing the Mongol scouts deeper into the valley, deeper into the jaws of a trap they had no idea existed. And then came the moment everything hinged on. Kitbuka arrived, a veteran general of the Great Khan, leading roughly 20,000 Mongol warriors, fresh from conquering Aleppo and Damascus. He saw his scouts pressing the attack. He saw what looked like a crumbling enemy line. And despite the narrow terrain any other commander would fear, Kitbuka did what Mongol leaders had done for 60 unstoppable years. He ordered the full charge. The Mongol horde thundered into Ain Jalut, confident, fearless, absolutely certain of victory. For a heartbeat, it seemed like history was repeating itself, that another army was about to be trampled into dust, but then the sound that would change the fate of the medieval world. Horns, dozens of them, echoing from every direction. The hills erupted. Tens of thousands of hidden Mamluk warriors poured down into the valley. Archers, cavalry, reserves, an entire army materializing from the cliffs. The Mongols, who had mastered the art of surrounding their enemies, suddenly found themselves surrounded. Still, they did not break. Kitbuka rallied his men and launched a desperate push to the south, their only possible escape route. For a terrifying moment, it looked like they might actually punch a hole through the Mamluk lines. Arrows filled the sky, horses crashed into shields, the ground itself seemed to shake, and then came one of the most dramatic moments in Islamic military history. Sultan Qutuz, who should have been watching safely from the rear, ripped off his helmet, raised his sword, and shouted, "O Islam!" With that cry, he charged headfirst into the Mongol line. His warriors saw it. They felt it. Their ruler wasn't hiding. He wasn't commanding from safety. He was fighting as one of them. The Mamluk counterattack exploded with unstoppable force. The Mongols were driven back, their formations shattered, and in the chaos, Kitbuka, the proud general of Hulagu Khan, fought like a lion, cutting down a dozen Mamluks before finally being surrounded and killed. By sundown, it was over. The valley of Ain Jalut was carpeted with Mongol bodies. Of the 20,000 who entered, only a few hundred escaped to carry the news back north. For the first time in over 60 years, the Mongol war machine had suffered a complete, undeniable, world-shaking defeat. Ain Jalut wasn't just a victory. It was a turning point in global history. The moment when the unstoppable finally met their match. What happened after Ain Jalut was more than a military ripple. It was a shockwave. For over half a century, the Mongols had appeared invincible, an unstoppable force tearing across continents, rewriting borders, erasing civilizations. They were the storm everyone feared, the empire that kings surrendered to before the first arrow was even fired. But on one September morning in 1260, in a narrow green valley in the Levant, that myth died. The defeat at Ain Jalut spread like wildfire. From Cairo to Baghdad, from scholars' halls to the humblest markets, one message echoed across the Islamic world. The Mongols can be beaten. For a generation that had lived in terror, this wasn't just news, it was a rebirth of hope. Even in Mongolia itself, the impact reverberated. Months later, when the great Khan Monka finally received word of the catastrophe, the empire reacted with sudden hesitation. The Mongol war machine stalled. Expansion into the Middle East and North Africa, once seen as inevitable, ground to a halt. Armies were pulled back, resources redirected. the unstoppable momentum that had fueled the Mongols for 60 years vanished. Ain Jalut didn't just win a battle, it broke the spell of Mongol invincibility. But victory came with a price. Sultan Qutuz, the man who had dared to defy the greatest empire on earth, did not live to see the consequences of his triumph. On the march back to Cairo, he was assassinated by his own officers, possibly orchestrated by none other than Baibars, his brilliant general and rival. In a twist worthy of a tragic epic, the hero who saved Egypt fell at the hands of the men he commanded. Baibars seized the throne, and under his rule, the Mamluk Sultanate entered its golden age. Baibars completed what Ain Jalut began. He reconquered Syria and Palestine, drove back the Mongols again and again, and crushed the last remaining Crusader strongholds along the Mediterranean coast. He turned Cairo into one of the greatest cities of the medieval world, a center of trade, scholarship, architecture, and culture. Scholars fleeing the Mongol destruction of Baghdad found refuge there, carrying knowledge that would eventually help spark the European Renaissance. Meanwhile, the Mongol Empire, once the largest land empire in human history, fractured. By 1300, it had splintered into 4 rival khanates, each vying for power, unity lost forever. The dream of a single Mongol world empire died in the very generation that had come closest to achieving it. And so, the legacy of Ain Jalut is not just that a great army was defeated, it's that a civilization was saved.